Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about The Other Side of the Wind. Now, this is, of course, the long thought to be lost and uncompleted film by Orson Welles that originally was made in the 70s, that was shot between 1970 and 1976, and then recently was paid for because of an Indiegogo, I think, Kickstarter kind of campaign, and Netflix stepped in and helped sort of pay for the rest and actually complete this film that for most of the time that I have been into film was a thing that I never thought would come out. I knew there were sections out there and so forth, but as a completed film I never thought that would exactly happen. And it's weird seeing it. You know, it's one thing to have a reboot of something or a reunion, but it's another thing to actually have, you know, a new Orson Welles movie with John Huston as its star, having, you know, lots of people in the cast be dead for a long time now, and them all having a new movie out is quite ridiculous. I think one of the oldest cast members was born 120 years ago, is what I read. I forget who that is, though. Because this film was made from 1970 to 1976, it is not really talking about now, It's talking about the 70s and youth culture and what was going on in film at the time and the perception of Orson Welles at the time and everything from Pauline Kael to sort of auteur theory a little bit, not directly, but it's like there, and all these other kind of 70s things. And it's sort of interesting, a film that was so much about the time it was made in was sort of kept in a time capsule and then released some 40 years later. It's obviously very interesting, almost overwhelming. It probably would have been overwhelming anyway, because when you built up such an image of a movie, you almost, I find the first viewing to be almost like, wow, this really happened. And then the second viewing, you really get the real movie itself, because you can watch that all the way, or at least for me, usually. But I noticed with this one, it almost felt like it was overwhelming by design. Like it wanted to be overwhelming. It wanted to have all these different things. It wanted to be crazy. And I don't know if there's a time I could watch this and really be able to take in everything. You know, there's certain like have conversations you're hearing, you're not sure what's going on. As much as like it's cool to talk about how this film is lost, I have noticed that the plot of the movie doesn't seem to be as publicized, which is interesting. Director Jake Hannaford, who is an aging Hollywood director played by John Huston, is filming kind of this movie that's going to be his big comeback movie that's going to be more of his 70s youth culture kind of film, like a European art movie, a Zabrisky's Point kind of Godard kind of film. So Zabrisky's Point was shot by Antonioni, but it's kind of all those things. He is going to have this big party at his house for his 70th birthday after a day of shooting to show off kind of a rough cut of the film he's making and kind of have all these various 70s luminaries there. And he kind of sets us off with an epic like ride to the party where he kind of sets up everybody and their attitudes. And then most of the film is inside the party where you're getting kind of the overlapping dialogue, very much of kind of like, I guess, sort of like Altman, but like way crazier. You're getting various different, I mean, this thing was shot on, what was it, 35-16. The film within a film, which is actually called The Other Side of the Wind, is shot in 70, and it switches between black and white, color, all these different formats all the time, which from what I've read now, we do that quite frequently. Usually it's more done nowadays for different locations and to represent something different visually about that location. First Man did it a lot. This does this like between cuts, like all the time. It'll cut from this thing to that thing to this thing. It's supposed to be that all these different film students and documentaries and things are all filming this event, and so it's sort of a documentary. I hear a lot of people say mockumentary, but the term mockumentary wouldn't really come about till the 80s when this film had already been shot but was sort of still being edited, I guess, depending on, I'm not sure the editing history. I did not watch the documentary, which if you watch this film on Netflix, they will recommend you watch right after it about the whole history of this. I do want to watch that, and I definitely will watch that, but I wanted to just talk about the film, not talk about the history. But I sort of understand when people want to talk about the history of it, because so much of it is clearly about Welles. You have Brooks Auteur, who is this other director played by Peter Bogdanovich, who's following around John Huston, an aging Hollywood director who's come back to Europe to make like his big comeback movie. It feels very much like Bogdanovich and Wells's relationship, even though supposedly that role was not supposed to be played by Bogdanovich originally. I kind of think that's a whole bunch of baloney, frankly. It just makes too much sense. There's even a part, and it fits too well, like the fact that they had someone else, that wouldn't have worked. But they even have a part which I think is like, so this film, like if Wells had lived to see what postmodernism would really do with film, I think he would first grin and smile at what it had become, but also be like, y'all were too tame compared to what I'm going to do in this, because he's referencing all these things. I honestly should have maybe boned up on 70s filmmaking before really going into this, because you have everything from Pauline Kael to Robert Altman clearly influences, to Antonioni, to Godard. So in the car, sorry, I stopped and came back here. In the car, Peter Bogdanovich is with John Huston, who's being interviewed by this young filmmaker in the way that Peter Bogdanovich did that to John Ford and directed by John Ford. And Peter Bogdanovich is right there, almost sort of laughing, smiling, looking at the reference to his own movie and looking at how foolish he was while it's parodying himself. There's a lot of self-deprecation in what Bogdanovich is doing. John Huston does a really great job. One of my favorite performances of the year from a guy who did his performance way before I was born. He did a really great job. He looks like a director who's haggard and wearied and is trying to fight for relevance, even though he doesn't need to fight for relevance. That's the thing I find so interesting about this, and a lot of people have read into this, is that Wells, and the problem with doing the review of this and any Wells thing is you kind of have to talk about Kane, but it's almost the most pedestrian thing, because he made other films other than Citizen Kane. He made a lot of films that he directed that are also very good. Citizen Kane, I think that the thing with that film in Wells's career, and the thing with his past work, like Touch of Evil, even The Third Man, Magnificent Ambersons, The Stranger, countless others that I'm probably leaving out. Those films loomed over him so greatly that this party, these things, this going out for dinner, his public persona, him being a character actor, him being on talk shows, him doing interviews, that was almost what he's more known for in the 70s. He never got asked to come back to the studio system, even as that was falling apart, and even when Auteur theory was blowing up, and clearly a big part of that Auteur theory was fucking Citizen Kane, which is the Raising Kane thing, which Kael wrote, which is why there's a character in this that is directly commenting on her. It doesn't go full Kael in a lot of sections. There's a part towards the end I was like, okay, that's the closest you actually got to her, to be perfectly honest. And see, this is the thing with this movie, is this is such a, hey, do you know, film history? Cool, I got a movie for you. Do you not? I don't know what you're going to get out of this, because the context I have is that I know what a lot of this is referencing. I know what this is doing, but it is so dense and cutting between all these different formats, which was very hard for them to do at the time, which makes it kind of just this overwhelming experience. Sometimes I felt like I was missing something, and I'm watching this whole movie. I paid attention, I stayed awake, all that stuff. I think a lot of people probably will turn away from this film because it's not what really Orson Welles is known for. It's very much a departure of a film. He's really trying to do something very different, but also kind of commenting on himself, commenting on him actually trying to make a comeback thing when the rules have changed, but everyone thinks he's amazing. There's probably every director in the 70s thought Citizen Kane and Orson Welles was an amazing luminary of a person, but at the same time, he had to make all of his films independently. The guy who was at the height of RKO at a certain period was basically they filmed this on the set of the new Dick Van Dyke Show in Arizona, which was in Arizona because of a whole thing. That's there's so many different stories of this film too. It's it's hard to watch this and not think of how it all came together. Was that shot from 1970 and that shot from 1973, and they cut them together somehow? The audio goes from one thing to the other. It feels almost like a mess. It feels almost like it doesn't work in some places, but in other places I think there's sort of a genius to that. It's one of the few films I've seen where I'm just where is this all going? But I kind of just want to enjoy the ride, and then I sort of notice where it's going, and I appreciate it so much. It's a very interesting flow of a film, and I think that's probably one of the most amazing things of The Other Side of the Wind. You hear this hype, and I've heard the segments of interviews where he's like, oh, it's like this totally different thing, and it is a totally different thing. I can't think of any films really like it, and I like how it kind of breaks down filmmaking and breaks down this period and, you know, cuts between all these different things and analyzes Wells himself in a way that makes me think he was very self-aware of what was going on. He was very self-aware of who he was and who he was in his life and how maybe he wasn't happy about that. He just wanted to create, and it sort of didn't matter because he was kind of overshadowed by his own creation. The Other Side of the Wind kind of shows, you know, although it's poking fun at all those things, he's almost poking fun at himself. He's talking about various directors, although, and this makes this story of this movie get even more complicated. The original concept for this was actually about Ernest Hemingway. It was developed in the early 60s. It was about bullfighting and all this stuff. And they mentioned bullfighters a couple times in this, which I assume is the only kind of remnants of that past script version or something. Obviously, Ernest Hemingway died, and he went on to do something different. I think John Huston is sort of playing Ernest Hemingway. I think he's also playing, like, various different directors. I've seen Wellman's name mentioned. I didn't really get a Wellman vibe, and I've seen every Wellman interview more times than most people have. I didn't really feel that way about it, but I will say that because of Wellman's book, A Short Time for Insanity, which did come out in the 70s, that might be why people think that, because he was a little more, getting a little weirder and stuff. Also with King Vidor made a weirder, kind of shorter film, which I can sort of understand why people might read into that. But I only really got Raoul Walsh, some of John Ford, but mainly it felt a little Hemingway. It felt mainly, though, like Wells. Going through this whole party, getting the vibe of a party, a crazy party that went on way too long, and you're just kind of in it and not thinking about what time it is, and keep going and partying and drinking and talking and experiencing this house and seeing this weird movie and complaining and drinking and talking and just filming and all these crazy things. I kind of got into the vibe of the party. It was a party that I didn't expect to get into the vibe of, because it felt like, as this film was cutting between all these things, referencing all these things, that I often wondered if I could fully get into it. And I did, but you kind of just unconsciously get there. I've noticed with a lot of Wells films, often when I'm a little tired, they seem to really hit me. And I was a little tired. I didn't get a lot of sleep last night. Not to get too personal or nothing. I think I was in the right mood for this film. I mean, I think if you want to see this movie, you're going to see it because you've waited so long and you've built this up in your mind. If you're just like coming to this like, oh, I hear this film is like an infamous lost movie and you don't know 70s filmmaking, I would be curious to hear your reaction. I think it'll mostly be like, I hate this. I think what Wells wanted to do is make something different from his own filmography and different for the time and critique the time, bring to task the time, but also kind of bring to task himself. You know, it's kind of like no one really leaves, you know, unscathed in this, and maybe his biggest comment is on himself, because I think he knew he had done great work, but he wanted to do more, and maybe in a way he sort of felt maybe he couldn't do that, but he could make this movie. I've heard people analyze even himself, like maybe he didn't want to make this movie. Maybe this film was too personal in ways, or maybe John Huston's performance just got to that, because Wells almost feels like he's cutting between so many things in such a crazy, frenetic way that you almost wouldn't take that as personal. But John Huston's performance was really, the more I think about it, and as I'm talking about this, I think about how wonderful that performance really is. I think John Huston did a really great job. And he has that epic, amazing voice. Just John Huston has one of cinema's and the world's great voices. And I also think Peter Bogdanovich is very, very good in this. This is a deep cinephile kind of gift of a movie. But if you are someone who appreciates these films, and you appreciate 70s filmmaking, and you appreciate Orson Welles, this is an interesting film, because I think bringing up Kane again, and I don't know, as much as he looked at someone else and looked at Hearst or Kane and looked at his life and tried to see, was he really saying the whole idea of the line that reporter says at the end, like, can one line really sum up a man's life? And I think this party, I don't think it sums up the 70s, I don't think it sums up all those things, but I think it just captures a period, and captures a period of him and showing him sort of analyzing himself. He started analyzing someone else, and then he came more inwards, and to really show I think how that analyzation of someone else came to kind of bring on his analyzation of his own self later in life, and how, you know, how he was in Hollywood, how it was coming back to a world that he didn't expect. And I think it gets all that craziness and shows that Orson Welles maybe wasn't done yet and was still plugging away. In some ways this feels so alive, but in other ways it feels, I don't know, this is a crazy fucking movie. I have to say, I can't really, I keep thinking there's a thing where it's like it really says something about him as a personality. It says something about him as a man and as an artist of the time, and I think it does. But at another point, it's commenting on all these things. It's having overlapping dialogue. It's filling in narrative gaps in weird ways. You can tell things are re-recorded from 2018, and others are restored, and others are in bad shape, and it's just black and white in color and 70mm, and you're just like, where the fuck even am I? And then, you know, John Huston will say something really real. This film has an interesting, amazing kind of experience of itself, but I think it just captures something about Welles and the 70s that we didn't really expect. Maybe such an honest answer, or I didn't expect such an honest answer from a man like Welles. He was always a magician, someone who hid behind all these, you know, had all these roles and performances and personas. You know, he's not in this film. Supposedly you can hear his voice in the reporters. I didn't. This whole party was for his larger-than-life persona, and the idea of him, they're all having the party while he's just in the corner talking to Bogdanovich. And I think that's probably the most perfect way to put the way Welles was in those last kind of 10 years, or those last times after he came back to Hollywood. And I think this film captures all of that, the chaos, the madness, and the reality of Welles's life, and kind of shows you maybe where he thought he would probably end up, cynically, even if he didn't. But I love the kind of inner thinking of him, and I think it just makes The Other Side of the Wind is kind of a whole new masterpiece from him. And I am a little like sitting here like I really just watched something special, and we were really given kind of a gift from the 70s that I never thought was even possible. And a lot of times while I was watching it, I was like, I don't actually think this is possible, but manages to become a real deep cinematic experience. So if you have seen The Other Side of the Wind and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.